Rick is awesome, and what's even more awesome is he left this up here. So I'm just saying, if I catch anybody falling asleep, there is no way that this thing should be anywhere near me. You shouldn't even trust me with a Nerf sword. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike King, and I'm the senior pastor here at Suburban. And this morning, we're continuing on in a teaching series that we've been calling Fully Alive. And the title of this series comes from something that an early Christian leader said a couple of thousand years ago. He said that the glory of God is a human being who is fully alive, right? God is most glorified when we, the people that he created, that he loves, when we are really living the full, free lives he created us to live. And that idea about being fully alive, Irenaeus actually got that from something Jesus said. At one point when Jesus was here on earth and he was teaching, he sort of laid out for people just what it was that he came to do, why he was here on earth. And he said this, he said, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. He says, but I have come so that you may have life and have it to the full. Right? Jesus came so that you and I, so that all of us, we can be fully alive in him. That was his goal, and that's really our goal as a church as well. It's to help people really meet Jesus and step into and live into the lives that he created us to live. And in this series, basically what we're doing each week is talking about some simple, practical things that we can do as we kind of make decisions about how we want to spend our time that can help us stay connected to God in a way that lets us be fully alive. And this is a great time of year to do that because, the school year is starting up. We're thinking ahead to how we want to spend our time, the commitments that we want to make. And we just want to encourage you all in this season to make some intentional choices, to do the things that will help you connect with God and live the life he created you to live. So to get started, we're going to talk a little bit this morning just about this idea of service, kind of what you've heard from Val and Waffle, and how finding a place to serve can help us be fully alive. So to do that, I want to invite you to turn with me in the Bible to Matthew chapter 14. If it would help you for any reason at all, there's some red Bibles in the seats around you. You can turn to the page number that's listed there up on the screen. But this morning, we're going to look at a pair of stories that if you really spent any time at all growing up in the church, you have heard these stories before. If you grew up in the church, like going to Sunday school, do any of you guys remember flannel graph? The little flannel pictures of Jesus, they'd stick them up on the board. Okay, these stories are so common, they were in every flannel graph starter kit that every Sunday school in America had. I mean, if the Bible had a greatest hit CD, these two stories would be on them. But we're going to look at them together because they come one right after the other. But even though they do that, there's a connection between these stories that sometimes we miss. And it's a connection that really does tell us something about what it means to serve and how that helps us be fully alive. So I want to dig in. We're going to start reading in verse 13. And where the story picks up at this point in Matthew's biography of Jesus, Jesus has just gotten the news that his friend and his cousin, John the Baptist, has been executed. Right? So he's gotten this news. John had this, unfortunate for him, habit of speaking truth to power. And at the time of this story, the Roman army was in charge of the land where the people of Israel lived. And the Romans installed a man named Herod kind of as the puppet governor to govern on their behalf. And Herod ended up marrying his brother's ex-wife, a lady named Herodias. And that just violated all sorts of laws and customs about what was appropriate. And John, on a regular basis, would publicly criticize Herod for this sort of immoral decision. He's like, you shouldn't be doing that. Well, as you can imagine, Herod and his new wife were not crazy about the fact that John kept bringing this up. So they have John arrested, and shortly after that, they have him executed. So we start reading in verse 13, and Jesus has gotten the news. So look at what it says here. He's just heard about the death of his friend, his cousin, right? He's reeling. I mean, remember, sometimes we forget that in terms of his emotions and what he experienced, Jesus was fully human, just like us. So to hear the news that this guy that he had grown up with, that he had loved over the years, that he had died, it really has an impact on him. So in verse 13, it talks about how he responds. It says, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. And again, that makes sense, right? Jesus probably wanted some time to come to terms with this. Maybe to remember some of the stories, the things that he enjoyed about his cousin when they were young. So he goes off, he's trying to find some time to be alone. But Jesus is also a very public figure at this time. People want to see Jesus. They want to see if he's going to do a miracle. They want to see if he's going to heal somebody. They want to hear his teaching. So the crowds don't particularly care that Jesus wants some alone time to grieve. So this is what happens next. It says, when they heard what had happened, that Jesus had gone off by himself, they decide, well, okay, they follow him on foot from the towns. So when Jesus lands in the boat, he's thinking he's going to have some alone time. He sees this huge crowd, and it says that he has compassion on them, and he heals their sick. Now, I can't speak for you all, but I probably would not have reacted quite as graciously as Jesus does. I mean, if I had just experienced a really significant loss and I'd sort of carved out some time out of my busy schedule to go and be alone, and a whole bunch of people show up that just want stuff from me, I probably would have been pretty rude and brushed them off. But again, in this story, we have yet another of the many reasons why I am glad that Jesus is Jesus and I am not Jesus, because he responds so graciously, right? It says he has compassion for the crowds. Right? He's able to sort of step out of his own pain and his own grief and his own needs and see the real needs of the people around him, and he reaches out to them in compassion and he heals their sick. And the day is going on and Jesus is doing that, and as we move on in the story, the disciples notice something. The disciples are Jesus' closest friends, his companions. They notice that Jesus has been going at it. He's been serving people all day, and the sun is starting to set, and it's getting a little bit late. So they kind of tap Jesus on the shoulder like, hey, Jesus, I don't know if you know what's going on. And they say this. They say, as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, Jesus, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus, I don't know if you've noticed this, but there are not a lot of good restaurant options out here in the desert. I checked, there's no nice food, farm-to-table kind of place that we can go to. There's no American Dream Pizza. Jesus, there is not even a Taco Bell. And that barely qualifies as food. I mean, but we've got to do something. These people are hungry. You need to go ahead and send them home so that they don't sort of faint from exhaustion on the road. And then get this. Look at what Jesus says to him, right? So he says all this, Jesus, here's this need, and Jesus replies, he says, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Okay, now let's just try to picture this scene with me for a minute, okay? I want us to imagine this. So you guys are kind of where Jesus is. Jesus is sitting out there. I'm the disciples. We're right here. And behind us, there is this enormous crowd, right? A little bit later on in the story, it says there's 5,000 men in the crowd. So plus the women, plus the children. So imagine like Gill Coliseum over at OSU's campus. It's full of people. Like that's the size of crowd that's there behind us. And it's late in the day, and they're getting hungry, and maybe they're getting cranky. And, Jesus is there, and the disciples are like, Jesus, we got to do something about this. Why don't you send these people home? And Jesus says, no, they don't need to go. You guys give them something to eat. I imagine the disciples kind of look at each other, and they're like, us? Like, you want us to give all of them something to eat? Like, Jesus, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot of them, and there's not a lot of us. So they're kind of dumbfounded as what to do. But they've been with Jesus long enough to know that they've got to reply. So they kind of look at each other. You have anything? No. I mean, do you have anything? Like, no, I ate my sandwich like an hour ago. So they're scrambling around, and this miracle story is the only miracle story of Jesus that shows up in all 4 of the biographies of Jesus in the New Testament. And in John's version of this, he has this additional detail. He says there's a little boy there who brought his lunch with him. He's got 5 loaves and 2 fish. So the disciples, they try to sort of figure out, well, what have we got? And they get together and they come back and they respond to Jesus. And they're like, okay, Jesus, here's what we've got. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And then don't miss this next point. Look at what happens next. Jesus looks at that and he says, bring them here to me. Right? That's all you've got? It's enough. Bring it here to me. Bring them here to me, he said, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, plus the women, plus the children. Hey, what a story, right? You give them something to eat. And the disciples are looking at each other like, how are we going to pull this off? We don't have anything. Jesus, this is all we've got. He says, that's all you've got? Bring it to me. Because it turns out that's enough. Right? When it comes to serving, when it comes to trying to meet a need that we see that God calls us to get involved in, all we can do is bring what little we've got. And it turns out with Jesus, that's enough. That's enough, right? That is always enough. We simply do what we know how to do. We do our part. We bring what we have, and then we trust God to do what only he can do. Right? We look, what do we have in our hand? We bring it to God, and we trust him to do what only he can do, and that is enough. And can you imagine like the conversations that the disciples had, walking down the road in the days ahead from this point forward? If Jesus were to come up to them and ask them to do something hard, something that seemed impossible, hey, I want you guys to start a church. I want you to stand up to persecution. They might look at each other and be like, well, that sounds pretty hard. But it can't be harder than feeding 5,000 people with what was basically like a Happy Meal's worth of food. And if Jesus can do that, well, then certainly we can trust him to do this. If he's asking us to do this, we trust that he is going to come through and help us do exactly what it is he's asking us to do. We learned our lesson. And really, my guess is that for them, that was just a defining moment. They walked away from that feeling energized, right? Feeling excited, realized that whenever God asked them to do something, they could do it with the full confidence that even if they felt unqualified, unprepared, everything, Jesus was going to be enough. He was going to help them get that done. And my guess is that they really walked away feeling fully alive. And that's why I wanted us to spend some time looking at these stories this morning. Because when it comes to being fully alive, to really living the life that God has for us, serving others in his name, in his power, that is a part of it. It's just part of what he calls us to do. I believe that every single one of us, there's something hardwired into every human mind and in every human heart. We want to be a part of something meaningful. We want to contribute. We want to make a difference. We want to help others. And when we see needs out there in the world that stir us, that move us, and we think, gosh, somebody needs to get involved, somebody should do something. Maybe that's God tapping us on the shoulder saying, yeah, you feed them. You get involved in that. And we may not have much to bring. We may not feel like we've got everything that we need. But what God shows us in this story is that whatever we bring, if he's the one calling us to do it, whatever we bring is going to be enough because he is going to make the results happen. And when we do that, when we really step into what he's calling us to do and serving others with our gifts and abilities and see his power work through us, that really can light us up and make us fully alive like very few other things can. There's a wonderful story of a lady, Christy Williams, in our congregation who's really living this out right now. So I want to share part of that with you via video. Christy, a little while ago, kind of found out about some of the needs in our community for foster care and foster parents and kind of started feeling a tug to do that. But she's like, I don't know how much I've got to add to this. I've just got an extra room in my house. And she kind of had this idea that she needed to do something bigger and grander. And just want to show a little part of her story where she talks about a conversation she had with a caseworker about that very thing.
Yeah, well, I was very nervous at first as a single mom that wasn't sure I did it right the first time around, and two, thinking I needed to provide in really big ways for this child. And one day the caseworker just said to me, you don't understand, because this child has their own room now, which they didn't have. This child has their own bed now, which they did not have. This child has, consistency and someone that's there for them all the time. And those are things that you're giving to them. So you don't have to throw the biggest birthday party ever, or provide all of the clothes that you think every child there should have, or, all the big things that I kept thinking I needed to do more. And she, helped me to remember that in foster care, lots of times, it's just being there. And it's just providing a roof over their head. Or, things that to me, that's the norm, have to do more than that. And it's not.
I'm grateful for Christy for letting us share her story, and there's so much more to it than that, and I know she would love an opportunity to talk with you about it. But it's such a cool story, right? Because she sort of found out about this need, And, she prayed about it, and she did what the disciples did. She kind of brought that need to God, just like they were like, hey, Jesus, there's some people who need to eat. She's like, God, there's some needs in this foster care community. And just like Jesus looked at them and said, you feed them, she kind of felt him tapping her on the shoulder saying, well, why don't you try and meet that need? And she's like, yeah, I didn't have much to offer. I wasn't even sure I raised my kids right the first time. You want me to do this again? I mean, how many parents recognize that feeling? But she said, well, what do you have in your hand? What do you have? Well, I've got an empty room. I've got some time and I can be there. And Jesus says, bingo. That's enough. That's enough. You bring that, and that will be enough. I will be there, and we will see this thing through to the end. Right? It's just an incredible story about how when we bring what's in our hand, like it's always enough. It's always enough. So keep that idea in mind. And I want us to go right back to the text, because I said we were going to look at two stories that come right back to back that actually have a lot to do with each other, and there's a connection. So I want us to jump right back into that in verse 22. So this is just ended, and look what happens. It says, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. Right, so you see it right there in the word, immediately. These stories come right after each other. They're connected to each other. He feeds the 5,000. They collect the food. Bam. Jesus puts his disciples in a boat, sends them across the lake, says, I'm going to send these people home. And the disciples start going. And then it says this. It says, after he had dismissed the crowd, Jesus went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So Jesus is up on the mountainside praying. The disciples are trying to get across the lake, but, the wind is picking up, the waves, maybe there's a little bit of a storm rolling in. So up to this point, the story is pretty normal. And then this is where, like the Twilight Zone music starts playing, and it gets a little different. It says this. It says, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage. It's me. Don't be afraid. And then look at this next line. Don't miss this. We're going to circle back to this in just a minute. Look at what Peter asks Jesus to ask him to do. He says, Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come out to you on the water. Well, come on, Jesus says. So Peter gets down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, truly you are the Son of God. Now, what is going on here? Why is it that Jesus decided to walk across the lake? I mean, it's a legitimate question to ask. Was he just in a hurry? Did he not have enough time to walk around the lake? He needed to sort of take a shortcut to get there? I mean, is Jesus just sort of trying to show off for the disciples? Like guys at parties that do magic tricks to try to impress girls. Is Jesus just showing off what he can do? Now, I know it sounds a little irreverent, but it's a legitimate question to ask. Because think about it. If you come from a worldview where you think, okay, the supernatural can't happen, miracles don't happen, it's easy to look at this story and just say, that stuff didn't happen. This first century author just added that stuff. People were more gullible back then. He's just adding some color to things. And if that's your way of viewing the world, I understand where you're coming from, but before you dismiss that out of hand, I just want to ask you a question. Okay, what if? What if this actually did happen? Right? If this really did happen, what do you think that would tell us about Jesus? Or maybe a good way to ask this is, why do you think Jesus chose to walk on the water right now? Because this is the only time it's recorded that he did that. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I were able to sort of bend the laws of physics to my will and walk on the water and do stuff, how often would you use that ability? I mean, I would do that all the time, because I'm about 5 minutes late everywhere I go, so I'd be like, red light? No problem, I'm over it. But Jesus doesn't do that. Do you know how Jesus got places most of the time? It's actually not a trick question. He walked, right? He walked. He took a boat. I mean, he did what we do. He did the work of actually getting there, even though he had the power to do it differently. So if normally what Jesus did was walk and do things the normal way, and in this one instance he decides to do it so differently, it's good to ask the question, why is he doing that right now? What is he trying to communicate? And I think that Jesus chose to walk on the water at this moment, and at this moment only, because in a way that hardly anything else could, it communicated to his disciples who he was and what he could do in their lives. Right? More than anything else, this would communicate clearly to them that he was God and that he had a power to do things on their behalf that goes beyond anything they ever could possibly imagine. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. Okay, so picture the scene, right? The disciples are out there. They're rowing the boat. The wind is picking up. The waves are picking up. They're struggling to get there. And they're out in the storm. And then walking along in this storm, right in the middle of the sea, the storm, the winds and the waves, they don't bother him. There comes Jesus. He's totally in charge of the situation. He is literally walking on the water. Now, to us, walking on the water is just a cliche, right? But it's something that would have communicated something very different to a first century Jewish audience. Because here's the thing. First century Jewish audiences, they didn't like water, right? You know, the neighbors to the north, the Phoenicians, they were famous as these seafaring people who would build boats, travel all around the world. The Jewish people didn't do that. In the earliest stories that the Jewish people have, when you look at how they talk about the water and about the sea, it is always a place of chaos and danger. Like it represents the sort of untamable forces of evil in the natural and supernatural world. Like for the Jewish people, the sea was something that you avoided, right? Because it was uncontrollable and chaotic. Even fishermen, you know, like some of the disciples, they would go out on the lake sometimes to fish, but they knew more than anybody else how quickly the sea could turn against you, how quickly a storm could come in. And when you look at all of the ancient writings of the people of Israel, there's only one person in their entire history who was able to conquer the sea, and that's God. Right? Think back to the pivotal, foundational moment in the history of the people of Israel, the Exodus. Right? They spend 400 years as slaves in Egypt. God delivers them from Pharaoh and brings them out. And how does he do it? He goes to the Red Sea and he parts it. He and Charlton Heston work on it together. They get the sea parted, you know, from the Ten Commandments. No, but that's what he does. He parts the Red Sea. And the Israelites walk through on dry ground, and when Pharaoh and the army tries to follow him, he has such mastery over the sea that he puts it back and he drowns them, and he rescues his people. Right? In all of their history, that's the only person who was able to control the wind and the waves was God. And if you look at some of the ancient poems of the people of Israel that we have recorded in the Bible as the Psalms, that's how they talk about it. So Psalm 93 describes it this way. It says, mightier than the thunder of the great waters, mightier than the breakers of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. Right? The sea is a place where chaos and danger ruled, and only God could tame the wind and the waves. And it is exactly into that kind of scene, right? It's a Psalm 93 kind of scene that Jesus comes walking into. And the sea doesn't defeat him. He bends it to his will. He is literally acting out and living out the words of this psalm. Mightier than the breakers of the sea is the Lord, is Jesus. Right? By choosing to do this miracle, to step out, to sort of make this powerful exception to the normal laws of physics this one time, he is communicating so clearly to that first century audience that he is God. And that the power that he has goes so far beyond anything that they can imagine, right? The feeding the 5,000, the power that they saw there, that's just like the initial step in the story. That's just a taste of what he can do. And I think somehow, you know, Peter, it's early in the morning, he's tired, he's been rowing all night, but somehow it starts to click for him. That this is what Jesus is trying to communicate by doing this miracle at this time to them. And so he asks something interesting. I pointed out that line to you. He asks Jesus to ask him to do something. So he says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you across the water. Now, put that request in sort of the sequence of the whole evening. So earlier that day, Jesus asked Peter, do something impossible. I want you to feed Gil Coliseum with a Happy Meal. And he shows up in his power, and he does it. He helps him do that. And Peter's like, wow, who is this guy? And then later that night, Peter sees Jesus walking across the water, right, living out the words of the Psalms. And I think Peter, it dawns on him. He's like, Jesus, the food thing, that was not a one-time miracle, right? He is God. He is all-powerful. And if that's true, anything he asks me to do, I can do it, even if it seems impossible. And I imagine in his sort of tired mind that early morning, he's like, I got to figure out if this is true or not. You know, if Jesus is power, anything, like, what would be really impossible to do in this moment? He's like, well, walking on the water. I've never done that before. That's impossible. He says, okay, Jesus, I think I've got this. I think I understand what you are trying to communicate to me by walking across the water right now. So let's put this to the test. Lord, if it's you, if you are who I think you are, if you really are saying to me what I think you're saying to me, if it's you, I want you to ask me to do the impossible. I want you to ask me to walk out to you across the water. And Jesus, I imagine, with a smile on his face, says, come on. Come on. And Peter does it. Right? He steps out on the water and he walks to him. And I think he does the impossible because Jesus asked him to. And I think Jesus sort of sets the story up because he knows that 2,000 years later, you and I would be sitting here talking about this story, letting us remind us of this simple truth, that if Jesus calls you to do something, he will carry you through it. Right? If Jesus asks you to do something, we can trust that he absolutely will help us do it. He will give us the power to do it. He will carry us through to the end of that task. And that right there, that's the key to being fully alive. When it comes to serving people in God's name, to address the needs that he lays on our heart, right? We just give God what little we have, what we simply know how to do, and we trust that he's going to show up and do the rest. That's what he said he would do to the disciples. That's what he tells us today that he will do. So he puts these thoughts in our mind and heart. He gives us a passion for things. He invites us to reach out and to serve others and care for others. And when he does that, if you're anything like me, most of the time you think, I am totally not qualified to do that, God. Like, did you see the guy over there? He's got like a PhD in that. You should probably ask him to go and do that. I don't have much in my hand. And God says, why don't you bring that to me? Because when you bring that to me and I'm asking you to do it, that's enough. You know, maybe all you've got is an extra room like Christy had and a little bit of time. Right? Maybe what you've got is some training as a vet. And God wants to call you to use that overseas in ways that you can't possibly imagine. Maybe when you look in your hand, what you've got is some money or some time or some skills that you've developed over the years, and you think, well, God, if you're calling me to do it, why don't you take this and let's see what you want to do through this. So there's just one question that I want to ask you as we leave today. What do you have in your hand? What is God calling you to do this year when it comes to reaching out to others, to serving others? Right? Maybe it's to get involved in some ministry here at Suburban. It's leading a small group with our high school students or adults. It's working in the nursery. You feel like, well, God, I may not know much, but I know how to change diapers. Great. Why don't you bring that to me and we'll do something amazing through it. Or maybe he's calling you to get involved in some of the needs in our community with foster care, or to volunteer at your kid's school, or to be involved with a nonprofit around town. Right? Whatever we are, when it comes to being fully alive, God has a role for each of us. And he's uniquely gifted us and given us experiences and things that we bring to the table that he can use in amazing ways. So what do you feel called to do this year? If you already know what that is and you've jumped in with both feet, we just want you to know, we just commission you to go out and keep at it. But if you're not sure how you can serve, if you feel like, yeah, that is a step I could take to help me be more fully alive, to live the life that God is calling me to live, then just come talk to us. Right? Give us a call, email us during the week. We'd love to just have a conversation with you about what maybe you uniquely are wired to do and what God might be calling you to do. Because God made you for a purpose. And whatever you have in your hand is enough. Right? If he calls you to do it, he's going to carry you through it. And as we finish out our time together today, we want to do two things. You know, we're kind of have a focus on college ministry today with students coming back to OSU and LBCC. And we have some wonderful college students who are helping lead this ministry. And I actually want to invite you guys. We're going to put your names up here on the screen. And if you guys can, just come on up here and stand at the front so that we can all look at you and make you feel awkward. Because what we're going to do, we're going to take some time as we finish up to pray for these students because they're just playing a role in helping lead this ministry. But I also want to invite all of you to stand because I want to pray for you. And I want to commission you in the name and power of God to go out and do what you have been uniquely called and gifted to do this year. So if you wouldn't mind, let's stand and we'll pray and head on out of here. So God, thank you. I thank you for the opportunity that we have to be here together today. We recognize that we have a chance to worship and gather together freely, and that's something that many brothers and sisters in Christ around the world simply do not have. They just don't have that freedom where they live. So help us not take that for granted. And God, as we step out into this new year, into this new season, just open up our eyes to see what we can do to connect with you through service to others, to help us be fully alive, and to help see your power work through what we bring to the table, to see your kingdom come and your will be done. God, we do want to pray for these students who are helping lead our college ministry this year. We are so grateful for the time and the prayer and the heart and the energy that they're bringing in. They are bringing you what they've got in their hands and saying, God, do something incredible through us. There's got to be close to 30,000 students in this town and in this county. And they're saying, God, use us to make a difference in their lives. So we pray that through your power, God, you would carry them through that. We look forward to hearing the stories of what you're doing in them and through them this year. And God, for each of us as we leave, we recognize there is a place for all of us to serve you, whether that's here in this local church or as an extension of this church in our community or around the world. So God, I just pray that you would do what you alone can do, that you would speak to each mind and to each heart, and to help them know what they've got in their hand, what you are tapping them on the shoulder to bring to the table, to use, to see people find out more about you and be fully alive in you. So as they go today, Lord, I pray that they would know, they would go empowered by you, that your Spirit is with them, and that if you are calling us to serve you in a certain way, we can do that with the confidence that you will carry us through to the end. So may we go today, Lord, as people who are empowered and made alive by your Spirit. Keep our eyes open to the ways that you want to work through us to change this world for your good and for your glory. Amen.